exciting to see this turnout and support.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Ben, there were actually fewer people at my job talk.
Oh.
Yeah, I like if everything we did at the university had this level of support and interest, it would just be amazing. So Ben, I'm really glad to see that. So, a couple of quick notes before we start. So how this will go is you'll present a presentation to us about your thesis, and then we'll have some time where we get to ask you some questions and probe a little bit deeper. And then traditionally, that's the point when we would ask Ben to leave the room so we could have a little private discussion. But since he brought the whole university with him, we will actually go out into the hallway and have our private discussion out there. How's that for the power of hegemony? And then we'll come back in and then we'll finish it up. Does that sound, do you have any questions?
Sounds good to me.
Anybody here have any questions? Yes.
During the question period, are we allowed to ask questions, or is it just going to be you three readers?
Yeah, I think at the end of that, when it starts to kind of taper down, traditionally it's okay if people in the audience want to chime in or have a question or two. Yeah. We good?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, why don't we let you take it away?
Awesome. So thank you all for being here this morning for my thesis defense. As many of you know, for the last several months, I've been working on this topic of researching internet memes, and specifically one meme in particular, Pepe the Frog, and kind of studying what that meme can tell us about internet memes in general and why they're unique from any other form of media, and why we should be paying more attention to them. Even though they exist only in online space, they can have significant effects in the physical world as well. So first things first, again, I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here this morning. It's great to have this support. I want to especially thank my thesis committee, Dr. Peter Alilunas from Department of Cinema Studies, Dr. Janet Wasko from the School of Journalism and Communication, and Dr. Tim Williams from Clark Honors College. They've really helped me figure out this thesis process, pushed me along the way. And I also want to thank all my friends who have supported me throughout this entire process as well, reminding me to never let my memes be dreams and pushing me to keep working on this. Before we jump into the meat of the presentation, just a couple quick housekeeping items. Some of the content that I'm going to be presenting today has kind of some vulgar language, potential hateful speech, anti-Semitic images, Nazi imagery, and whatnot. So just so you're aware that that's coming up, if at any time you do feel that there's kind of some overwhelming stuff, feel free to step out into the hallway if you need to. Totally fine. As Dr. Alilunas mentioned, we'll have time, hopefully, for a couple questions at the end. So I've been, for the last several months, focusing on Pepe the Frog specifically, this internet meme that has actually existed for about a decade, but during the 2016 presidential election, kind of was forced into mainstream culture because it was being used actually within the political debate itself. And I was really interested in it after I saw this image here. This was in 2015, posted by then candidate Trump, showing him photoshopped to look like Pepe the Frog himself. And then later, his son Donald Trump Jr. actually posted on Instagram this image of the deplorables. This was after the debate where Clinton had called Trump supporters a, quote, basket of deplorables, and they kind of took that as a badge of honor. And so, again, we see Donald Jr., in this case, photoshopped to look like Pepe the Frog specifically. And the fact that this cartoon frog was suddenly playing a role in our U.S. political process, if you just take a step back and think about what that actually means, like a cartoon frog is influencing our election, that's an absolutely ridiculous concept, and I wanted to kind of dive into that and figure out what was going on. Especially once the Clinton campaign responded to that and accused the Trump campaign of using this cartoon frog as a symbol of white supremacy, and specifically as a hate symbol. It seemed like there was some interesting stuff to get into. So I decided to use Pepe the Frog as a single case study for internet memes in general, cataloging just hundreds of different instances of this meme to trace its history from its origins back in 2005 to where we're left at today in 2018, where it kind of exists in this weird space where white nationalist subgroups have claimed that image for themselves and changed the meaning. And so I'm trying to use this one meme to examine memes in general. How are they functioning as a medium? Why are they different from, say, any other form of media? And the ability for a certain subculture to take that image and redefine it. So there's four main things we're going to go over this morning. First, why should we study memes in general? Then we're going to talk briefly about some of the historical theoretical background, if it was like any other form of media, what we might expect to take place with this. Of course, what actually happened with Pepe the Frog, as we know, it turned out being different as it turned from this innocent cartoon frog into an actual symbol of white nationalism, and then finally a little bit of discussion about some of these potential implications. So thing number one is why should we study memes in the first place? And the first thing, as many of us are aware, is that memes are pretty much everywhere in today's society. We see them in our news feeds, we see them in our advertisements. It's hard to go a single day without seeing an internet meme in one form or another. And what I've found is that memes behave uniquely from other forms of media, unlike, say, TV shows or music or even, newspapers. The way that a certain small group is able to take an internet meme and claim that meme for themselves and change its meaning is different, whereas in other forms of media, you have to have a significant amount of power. You have to be a major broadcaster in order to actually control that image. And finally is the fact that memes have wide-reaching effects. Like I mentioned, they're widespread in advertisements within our political process. And even though we often think of them existing, on our Twitter feeds or on our Facebook pages, they really do have effects in the physical world as well. And therefore, it's worth looking into. One particular interesting aspect is this idea that internet memes are owned simultaneously by no one and everyone. They're kind of something that the public engages with collectively, yet simultaneously there's not one single person that controls a meme, or say, even if you created it, doesn't necessarily define how it's meant. So in my study of Pepe the Frog, I came up with a couple specific methods. Even though there was some scholarship done in online communication previously, there wasn't a lot specifically in the area of internet memes, so I kind of had to nail down a couple specific definitions before diving into my study specifically. The first one being the actual definition of this word. A lot of us have an idea of what memes mean and kind of are familiar with the concept, but actually nailing down what that word represents was important, as I was going to be writing about it extensively. And so the term was actually first coined by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. He was writing about DNA and genetic information, and he said instead of having DNA to transfer genetic information, you can use a meme as an idea to transfer cultural information or ideologies, saying it was a unit of cultural transmission, a unit of imitation. And he was one of the first people to identify the importance of the nature of spreading virally, an idea that will spread rapidly from one person to another. However, Dawkins wrote about memes kind of more broadly than our modern definition. For example, he said that like pop music or fashion trends could be an example of a meme. Or I even said that the idea of having an omniscient God in society was a meme that existed. However, today our modern definition of memes has changed slightly and refers specifically to online communication. So I'm defining a meme as any combination of images, video, text shared in an online community and has a commonly understood meaning and usage. And so it's important to understand there's a difference between just an image being shared online and an actual meme. And the difference being that it is shared rapidly. It has repeated transmission. Every time it's shared and spread, it changes slightly. People can download it, edit it, and share it again, or even just slightly change the meaning of it as they share it in new contexts. And there's some scholars, Matt Applegate and Jamie Cohen, they wrote about online communication, and they wrote that memes represent a mode of communication more articulate than the emoji, but less robust than the grammar and syntax of a natural language, which is really just a fancy way of saying that memes can have a meaning beyond just what's in the image itself. It's got all this background context to it, and that's kind of what makes them unique as a medium and unique from any other form of media as well. And so as part of that, I define this difference between a meme as a whole, for instance, the Pepe the Frog meme, this whole phenomenon, and an individual instance of Pepe the Frog. So what I'm saying is that an instance is just one individual image, one occurrence of this meme, so this one single image, and all the instances of the meme that exist contribute to the meaning of the meme as a whole. And so the meme is composed of all those individual meme instances, and it's influenced by each individual meme instance. So if we have, say, a handful of meme instances, those on their own is just a single image, but because they're connected to the Pepe the Frog meme as a whole through the shared images and the shared context, they all contribute to the overall meaning of that meme, which is influenced by each individual meme instance, which in turn will also inform every other instance of the meme as well. And so that's what I mean when the meaning is more than just that single image. It has all this background context to it. Each image doesn't exist isolated. And what that means, though, is if, say, someone creates a new instance of Pepe the Frog that has, say, new imagery on it. For instance, in this case, someone has photoshopped a Hitler mustache on this frog here and added a swastika on this teacup. It acts just like any other meme instance. So there's really no way to differentiate this meme instance from all the other ones as what's official use and what's unofficial use, which means that once someone creates this instance, it too flows into the overall meaning of the meme as a whole and starts influencing how that entire thing is understood, and then also will flow back into every other meme instance as well. And unlike any other form of media, what that means is that you can actually influence the meaning of another image just by changing a different image entirely. In other words, you can take just a few instances of this meme with certain meanings, for instance, those white nationalist ideologies, and that'll start influencing and changing every other instance of that same meme as well, without ever touching those other instances. And that's pretty significant. There's not really any other form of media that you can do that with. And then finally, a couple quick other notes just on my methodology. I gave myself a cutoff date of September 2017. I wasn't going to look at any content past that date just so I wouldn't be overwhelmed with too much. Finally, another aspect was the kind of the ephemerality dealing with online content. A lot of people think that in the age of the internet, once you post something online, it's there forever. Well, we've actually found in the digital era, it's easier than ever for stuff to get lost. Once it's pulled off the internet, it kind of just disappears. So I would save screenshots of everything, catalog as much information about the website as possible. And that did actually prove to be useful, especially like the Clinton campaign pulled down a lot of their websites soon after the election. And so I was glad that I actually had managed to save archived copies of those to be able to use in my research. And then finally, just a quick note on the language that we use to refer to some of these white nationalist subgroups. A lot of times in the mainstream media, they'll use the term alt-right or neo-Nazi to refer to those groups. But instead, what I've chosen to do is follow the recommendations of the Associated Press, which is to avoid using those terms entirely. The reason is like they want to be called the alt-right to present themselves as a legitimate political group, when in reality what it really is just groups of white nationalists or white supremacists. And finally, we really only should be using the term Nazi if there's evidence to point to the fact that these groups actually subscribe to the ideas of the Nazi Party and support that those ideologies and aren't just white nationalists. So in general, I'll be using the terms white nationalists or white supremacists instead of alt-right or Nazi. And so with those methods, I was essentially just had to establish all these so I could tackle this basic question: how do we get from this innocent cartoon frog started as simple cartoon to a meme that is associated with white nationalism and is playing a significant role in the presidential election? Over the course of a decade, this meme, Pepe the Frog, transformed significantly. And my argument is that the reason that was able to happen is because internet memes inherently are unique in the way that they function. Which brings us to thing number 2, our theoretical framework, what we would have expected to happen as Pepe the Frog was spreading and becoming more and more popular. And so it's all kind of tied up in this idea of cultural hegemony. And hegemony refers to the dominance of one social group over another. So in any diverse society, you've got many different subgroups within it, you know, your own different groups of people that you associate with, interact with. And hegemony refers to the ability in that diverse society for one of those groups, the dominant group, to maintain control over all the other ones. And the way that they can do that is presenting their ideas as normal or just the way that things are. And so, you know, for instance, in our society, you know, capitalism is one of those hegemonies that just kind of exists throughout our day-to-day lives. We just accept it as just the way things are, as the default state, when in reality, that's a hegemony that's being constantly produced and reinforced throughout our lives and everything that we see. And so that's what, when I refer to dominant culture, that's what I'm talking about, is the ability for them to maintain one of these hegemonies and push their ideas over any other subcultures that exist within it. And so, like I said, capitalism is a good example. The United States two-party system is another example. It's something that a lot of us just accept as just the way things are, when in reality, that's something that has been developed over time and is constantly reinforced. On that note, a scholar that I've leaned heavily upon is Dick Hebdige, who wrote in Subculture, the Meaning of Style about hegemony specifically. Again, he's saying that hegemonies, once they're established, they don't just exist forever. They have to be, one, reproduced and sustained, constantly rebuilt. And so in this book, he wrote about the ability for a subculture to try to challenge one of those cultural hegemonies and try to push back against those ideologies that are being pushed down by that dominant group. And he says that through a model of commodification, it's possible for the dominant group to actually kind of neutralize any threat by a subculture. And so, as an example, we might, for instance, consider the subculture of hipsters. And any subculture kind of is a challenge to that dominant culture. Hebdige uses the phrase, an interference in orderly sequence or a moral panic. And basically the issue is that any subculture can potentially threaten the stronghold of that hegemony. And a subculture will usually have certain symbols that they use to define themselves. For instance, really skinny jeans, glasses that don't actually have lenses in them, using the Helvetica font on everything, things like that. However, what Hebdige says is that once a subculture is established and has these certain symbols that it's using to identify itself, the dominant group is able to take those symbols from that subculture. So for instance, we've got these certain characteristics that define a subculture, and what can happen is the dominant culture will actually take those images from the subculture and then commodify them, turn them into commercial products, and monetize them to the point that you will sell them back to that subculture and therefore neutralize any threat to the dominant culture. So the fact that now you can, walk into American Apparel and find, those nice tight-fitting jeans. You can go online to your Pinterest boards and here's how you get the hipster style. That represents the commodification of that subculture. And so Hebdige's predictions apply to all sorts of forms of media. You can see it in television, movies, especially in fashion, day-to-day lives. But what I have found is that Hebdige's predictions about commodification, the ability of a dominant group to take an image from a subculture and commodify it and sell it back to them, it doesn't work with internet memes. And so if it did work, what you would expect to happen with Pepe the Frog is it's initially created, certain subcultures, white nationalist groups start using it for their own means and injecting their own ideologies to it. But in response, the dominant culture can take that meme, monetize it, turn it into a commercial product, sell it back to those subcultures, and get rid of that those white nationalist and subcultural meanings. And that is what you would expect to happen if Hebdige's model applied to internet memes. And of course, the fact that we're all here today talking about Pepe the Frog shows us that that is not what happened, which brings us to part number 3. What actually happened? How did Pepe the Frog turn from being just a simple meme into an actual symbol of white nationalism, and why was it that it was unable to shake those meanings entirely? So to talk about it, I've kind of mapped out the 10-year-long history of Pepe the Frog. An important note is this history isn't entirely linear. Kind of happened, a lot of stuff happened about the same time. I've kind of tried to organize it into 5 distinct stages, but as with any history, it's messy and it doesn't always follow a distinct timeline. So we'll start part 1, the creation of Pepe, and it began back in 2005 in a comic book by a cartoonist named Matt Furie, and he created it originally in a zine called Playmates, right here. Pepe has a snack attack. You can see he's still got those same distinct features, these big droopy eyes, the big lips, the rounded head. And eventually after that he appeared in a different zine called Boys Club, which Furie created for just him and some of his friends. He talked in a lot of interviews, he would literally go down to a Kinko's to make copies of it and distribute it amongst his friends. So it really wasn't meant for widespread distribution at first. And he described it, you've got Pepe along with his friends Andy, Brett, and Landwolf, and Furie calls them, quote, 4 best buds as they smoke, drink, puke, and party their way through life. So the main takeaways is that at this initial stage of Pepe the Frog, it was just kind of a generic representation of what it means to be a young adult living with some of your friends. He didn't have a specific goal in mind. He just wanted to kind of represent some of his own experiences as he was growing up. And most importantly, he didn't really want to take a political stance with this at all at this point. He was just creating a cartoon to share with his friends. And so Boys Club was a very obscure underground zine at first during the 2005-2006 era. It was not very widespread. There was a couple copies you could get online. But what happened is eventually some people who had found the zine took some of the images from it, started posting it online, and that's when we get to stage 2 of Pepe's history, as it starts turning into an internet meme as people start spreading it around in online communities as well. Basically what happened is someone took this frame from the original Boys Club cartoon, which is Landwolf and Pepe having a conversation with each other, and they cut out this specific feels good man frame of Pepe right here, turned it into this image right here, and started circulating it in online communities. And so it's hard to say initially who did this first, due to the anonymous nature of online communication, but we do know that a lot of the early use of Pepe spread online was on websites such as 4chan, which is an image board website, and what's significant about it is you have to have an image you have to attach a picture if you want to start a new post. So a lot of people would say, post, this sad frog or the smug frog, just as kind of some sort of a context for their post, like here's how I'm feeling, or here's the emotional context of my post. And that would that's how these images started spreading online. And so it's just kind of like a generic reaction image. People would start photoshopping Pepe into other contexts, such as onto Kermit the Frog. And it's slowly, throughout this process, Pepe goes from being just an obscure image online into being an actual meme, now that it's being spread rapidly on online communities, being constantly changed. However, what's important to note is that at this time, it doesn't really have any significant ideological meanings. Kind of just represents internet culture in general. The idea of like, I know how to use online space. The fact that I am using this Pepe the Frog image shows that I understand the online community. I fit in here, but it's not necessarily with any political messaging as well. There was even a brief instance of rare Pepe sales where people, in response to the image spreading rapidly online, were saying, oh, well, we have to, quote, protect the value of this image. And so they started treating it like trading cards, even putting fake watermarks on them to, supposedly protect the value of the image. Of course, with digital images, you can just keep making copies of it. So this entire phenomenon was a little bit contrived. This might be a case of a dominant ideology, in this case capitalism, taking over the meme, people actually assigning value to these images. But the fact that the meaning of Pepe the Frog soon moved past this and into kind of white nationalist groups shows that dominant ideology wasn't able to maintain power over the meme. So, as I said, in general, at this early stage, Pepe just kind of represented internet culture in general. It didn't have a specific meaning. It just was able to represent online communication. And it was really just a shell that you could easily redefine and mold to fit whatever meaning you wanted it to fit in your online communication. One other important note is that at this point in Pepe's history, Matt Furie really didn't care about how his image was being used. He thought it was actually pretty cool that this obscure cartoon he created was becoming super popular online. And so in several interviews he said, I don't know why my cartoon frog became popular, but I'm not going to do anything to stop it. However, while this is happening in certain subgroups, those obscure online communities where certain groups are actually able to gather, they were taking the image of Pepe the Frog and corrupting it and adding their own extreme symbols and ideologies to it. And these were separate in kind of in isolated online communities at first. And it was only really in the scope of the presidential campaign that those isolated communities and their new meanings got pushed into mainstream awareness. And so basically what happened is we went from those earlier instances of Pepe the Frog, which were just pretty generic, didn't have any specific ideological meanings to them, to people were specifically putting together meme instances such as these. We've got specific anti-Semitic messaging. We've got actual images and symbols of Nazi Germany. So we've got this SS uniform here, or as we saw in this meme instance earlier, actually just blending together the image of Pepe the Frog and the characteristics of Adolf Hitler. And so this is obviously a big shift from those earlier uses of Pepe the Frog. And this was happening in those isolated sub-communities. So you wouldn't necessarily see these everywhere online on the internet, but they would pop up here and there. And slowly, through that cycle of memes and meme instances, slowly influence the overall meaning of the meme as a whole. And so the reason that this was happening, there's a couple of potential reasons. One of them is as a reaction to that mainstreaming of Pepe. As it was becoming increasingly popular, even celebrities such as Katy Perry or Nicki Minaj were tweeting out images of Pepe the Frog, and people in those online communities were really upset that groups that they would call normies or the normal people were using what they considered to be their meme, and they wanted to reclaim it. These subgroups wanted to say that the mainstream culture wasn't allowed to use that meme, and one way for them to do that was by attaching really extremist imagery and ideologies to it to discourage the mainstream culture from using their meme entirely. I keep saying theirs. Of course, it doesn't actually belong to them, but they wanted to claim that it did. There's also the possibility that it was a simple internet joke, albeit in poor taste. The fact is that because with anonymous communication, a lot of those filters that you would have in face-to-face discourse just kind of drop down, and people will joke about things that are really not appropriate to joke about. And then, of course, there's an important part of this as well, that there are genuine white nationalists online using online communication technologies to find one another, interact with one another, and creating really offensive meme instances such as these, where it's a way for them to not only identify one another, but also just spread their ideologies online as well. And the thing is that with the internet, it's impossible to determine the boundaries between these groups. You can't really determine what someone's intent is online unless you can go to that person and actually ask them, what did you mean when you posted this? What did you mean when you created this? And because a lot of these communications were happening in an anonymous nature, it's just not possible to do that. And so even if it was potentially started as partially as a joke or partially from actual white nationalists, the fact remains those white nationalist meanings slowly become embedded in the overall meaning of the meme as a whole, whether or not it started as a joke or not. Of course, I would like to believe that most people are not actually white nationalists online, but I think what we have found in recent years is that these sub-communities are not as small as we previously thought they were, and the fact that this meme was able to become redefined into a symbol of white nationalism shows not just how widespread these groups are, but the ability of them to take over the meaning of this meme as well and redefine it. And again, the reason it was able to happen is because of this cycle of meme instances and the overall meme as a whole. Just by changing a couple of these, you're able to change the meme entirely, which then goes back and changes every other instance of the meme as well. And so in that way, you kind of have this meaning and the difference between that so-called ironic community, the people who are joking about it, actual white nationalists using this meme, and then eventually what we'll find in 2015, 2016, that spreads to Trump supporters as well. And all these groups kind of get mashed together into one, people who are using Pepe the Frog, and it's really difficult or impossible to distinguish boundaries between these groups and say who's using it for what. And what's really significant is that this meme quickly spread from existing in online space to actually into the physical world as well. I'll briefly go over that in this kind of quick phenomenon I'm calling the cult of Kek, which was this odd thing that took place recently. And basically this started Kek as a phrase from the game World of Warcraft. It was this basically the enemy chat. They had a chat function online. Anything by the enemy team any text would be kind of scrambled or obscured, but people quickly found out that LOL, laugh out loud, got translated to Kek online, so that started spreading in online communities as a way to say LOL instead. However, what someone quickly found out, a user on 4chan's history board, discovered there was an ancient Egyptian god called Kek that represented the primordial concept of darkness. That's real. And again, pure coincidence, Kek was always portrayed with having a frog head. And so it's a very unfortunate coincidence because certain users pointed that out and started drawing connections between that Egyptian god and Pepe the Frog specifically, saying that Pepe the Frog was, maybe the most recent coming of this ancient Egyptian god. They found these hieroglyphics and claimed, oh, this might be a person at a computer. And of course, that's not what the original intention was. This was created in ancient Egypt. But in the 2000s, people reading this said, oh, this proves that Pepe the Frog means something special. Again, maybe they started it as a joke. Maybe they didn't. But the fact remains, since it was happening in these anonymous communities, you really can't tell if it was a joke or not. And they called this meme magic, the manipulation of the root social matrix and fabric of reality. And basically what these groups were saying is you could use internet memes to actually influence what they said, events in the real world. What I'm saying is things in online space will translate into physical space as well. So even though the whole idea sounds kind of far-fetched, that basic concept that whatever's happening in these online communities will affect physical events is something that is a real effect, and we can see that happening. They actually created a fictional country called Kekistan, created this flag for it, and even encouraged people in the United Kingdom, which has on their census the ability to write in your own ethnicity, to write in Kekistani on the UK census. Again, maybe this was started as a joke. Maybe it was started by people who were actually trying to push back against the use of Pepe the Frog and just memes in general by mainstream culture. But the fact remains that even though it might have been partially done as a joke, it probably wasn't entirely a joke. This here is the Nazi war flag from World War II. This here is that fictional flag of Kekistan. And as you can see, there's a lot of similarities between the two. They've obviously swapped out a couple of the symbols and the colors, but the overall image looks about the same. And so again, maybe it was people trying to make jokes online and push back against mainstream use of memes in general by attaching these extreme ideologies. Maybe it was people who are actually white nationalists or actually neo-Nazis. And in reality, it was probably a combination of the both of them. But through this whole cult of Kek phenomenon, they took this meme that was existing in online space and started pushing it into the physical world as well and saying, hey, these events that are happening on the internet are going to influence real-world events. Undeniably, it's connected to things that are real, even though it is just a cartoon. And so brings us to another phase where Pepe gets forced into the mainstream culture through the election. And so some of those groups, white nationalist groups, may have also ended up being Trump supporters as well. Some of them may have just been Trump supporters who are not white nationalists. But again, as is the common theme with online communication, you really can't tell the boundaries between those groups. And what happened is people started creating new meme instances of Pepe the Frog, specifically containing, say, Trump's hairstyle, Trump's campaign messaging, or in this case, it's a caricature of Clinton being locked up in prison. And these were common campaign themes throughout the presidential campaign. And people were essentially using the Pepe the Frog meme to support their candidate of choice, Donald Trump. And so this is what I mean when they were referring to that so-called meme magic and the ability to influence real-world events. Here we see a meme that started as just like an online image being spread back and forth, and it's actually really crossing over into the physical world as well and influencing real-world events. And of course, once Trump and Trump Jr. start tweeting about it as well, that's kind of an official acknowledgement that this has reached the mainstream. It's widespread. It's hard to ignore it at that point, especially once most mainstream news outlets are reporting on this as a hate symbol, saying that the Anti-Defamation League has declared it as a hate symbol. That's the same designation given to, say, the swastika or cross burning by the KKK. And what's important is, for a lot of people, this is how they were introduced to Pepe the Frog in the first place. If you weren't familiar with online communities, this may have been your first exposure, and that kind of solidified that redefinition that had been happening through that cycle of memes and meme instances. Once it's introduced to you and pushed on you by every media outlet, it's kind of solidifies this new meaning. And at that point, it's pretty difficult for the dominant mainstream culture to reclaim that image and commodify it and claim it back and redefine it from its white nationalist meanings. Which brings us to, really briefly, the last section, the so-called future of Pepe, and Furie's attempt to reclaim his image and its meaning. Soon after the election, Matt Furie became involved in his image again. He started this Kickstarter campaign to save Pepe. He tried to raise money in an attempt to publish new comics and show the true meaning of Pepe and use it as a force for good, and attempt to redefine Pepe as not a white nationalist symbol, but as his original work. So he says that he condemns the illegal, repulsive appropriations of the character by racist and fringe groups, and he says, interestingly, that the true nature of Pepe is of peace, togetherness, and fun, which, if you actually look at the original cartoon as they're, puking on top of each other, drinking excessively, peace, togetherness, and fun might not have actually been the original meaning, and this is just, again, an attempt to really redefine it away from white nationalism. And so what Furie's really trying to do is sort out between all these meme instances. Here I've only shown you a handful, but pretend there's thousands of them here. And what he's trying to do is say that there's some sort of differentiation between the official meaning of Pepe, the peace, togetherness, and fun, and the unauthorized meaning of Pepe, the white nationalist, the Nazi imagery, all those hateful connotations to it. And of course, it was an attempt to make some money off of it as well. He was trying to sell comics back to all those subgroups as well, saying, nope, this is the real version of Pepe, buy this new comic, and this is going to redefine the meaning. But the problem is, with internet memes, is it's always possible for that subculture to crank out more and more meme instances. Even if Matt Furie somehow claims the image back and starts selling it back as a commercial product, it's always possible for another group, another small subgroup, to create more instances of the meme that have whatever imagery that they want to have with it. And therefore, even though Furie owns the meme and controls it, he's not able to redefine it and take it away from its white nationalist meanings. And so the main takeaway from all this is that, unlike any other form of media, it is impossible to ever fully commodify an internet meme. And that's where that initial process that Dick Hebdige predicted kind of breaks down. He says that a dominant culture can reclaim an image, commodify it back, and monetize it, sell it back to the dominated group as a commercial product. What I've found is that with internet memes, that process just doesn't function in the same way. And Matt Furie kind of admitted defeat as well. He created this cartoon showing the death of Pepe's. He realized that he wasn't going to be able to reclaim the image from white nationalists and decided that it would be best to just kill off the character entirely, admit defeat, and try to move past it. So he created this comic showing Pepe along his original friends at his funeral and kind of a fitting send-off, pouring alcohol on his dead body. But of course, within a few days later, Pepe is completely back to life and fully out of Matt Furie's hands. This cartoon was created by Ben Garrison. He also made a bunch of pro-Trump, anti-Hillary, and white cartoons with some white nationalist undertones to them as well. And here we see Pepe basically walking away from Matt Furie, not recognizing his original creator at all. And so essentially, Matt Furie tried to reclaim his image. The dominant group tried to take that image from the subgroup, commodify it, and sell it back to those cultures and redefine the meaning from white nationalists, and that just wasn't able to happen. And so finally, a quick speculation on what this all might mean for everything. What can Pepe the Frog as a single meme tell us about memes in general, and why does this all matter? The big takeaway is that memes as a medium are unique from many other forms of media. In terms of ownership and control, with other forms of media, if you own, say, the TV station, if you own the publishing company, you can control the content and the meaning of it as well. With internet memes, that's not the case. Just because you own a certain number of those instances, you don't control the meaning of it as a whole, and that has to do with that meme instance and meme cycle as well. It's always possible for someone to redefine it. Additionally, widespread transmission, memes are everywhere in our society. They're all over the place, and the fact that they spread so rapidly, it's so easy for someone to download a copy, makes quick changes and uploaded it again, is really significant and makes it possible for that meaning to constantly be changing. And then finally, is this notion of meme magic, which is what it was referred to in that cult of Keck phenomenon. But again, that's just that simple notion that these events that are happening in online communities and online space are not isolated to those areas as well. They influence events and are affected by events in the physical world as well, and that what we consider the real world exists both in the physical space and an online space as well. And so what we have found is that with memes, the art form itself is entirely separated from its artist. And so that made me turn to Roland Barthes, who wrote The Death of the Author. And in his essay, he's writing that to give an author to a text is to impose upon that text a stop clause, to furnish it with a final signification to close the writing. He's saying that the meaning of a text is not determined by the author, the person who actually created it, but rather who's reading it, how it's interpreted, and the context in which it's being presented. And what we have found with that meme instance cycle is that memes are anything but a closed text. They are not closed. They're constantly going through this cycle and constantly being redefined. And as such, we shouldn't be thinking of internet memes like any other form of media where once it's created, it's kind of out there in the world. Whoever made it can redefine its meaning as well. And so even though Matt Furie is the original creator of Pepe the Frog and created it, he doesn't control the meaning of it, and it's going to constantly be changing in these online communities. And the fact that here we've got images from, this is a rally that happened in Berkeley after Ann Coulter was scheduled to speak there. Someone has physically made a version of the flag of Kekistan, or someone has physically put Pepe the Frog on this helmet right here. It's just the fact that things that are happening that may start in these online spaces will transfer into the real world, into the physical world as well. And what we consider the real world exists in both of those spaces entirely. And so internet memes are in nearly every aspect of our lives. They're within our advertisements, they're in our popular culture. As we've seen, they're a huge part of our political process as well. And so the ability for a small subgroup to take one of those images and redefine its meaning through that cycle is really significant. And for any, say, corporations that are trying to use memes in their advertisements or companies that are trying to take advantage of them, they should be aware of this process because they always run the risk of whatever image they create being redefined and resold and not being able to reclaim that image and maintain control of its meaning. Internet memes are always going to be a force in our lives in our increasingly online society, and so being aware of kind of how they function is really important. So the main takeaway that I want to leave you all with is this one final thought, which is the idea that once the meme machine has been started, there is no shutting it off, and once you've started it, there is no predicting where it's going to lead. This entire thing started with me looking at a single tweet by our current president, and it turned into something that was bigger than I ever could have imagined. And I can only predict that internet memes are going to continue to play an incredibly significant role in our lives. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I'm to take questions now.
Thanks, Ben. That was a really terrific presentation. Thank you for that, and also for this thesis. Maybe we should let Ben sit down. Maybe we'll sit. So I don't know where, but if you want to sit somewhere, you certainly are welcome to. I'm just going to say a couple things and then let my colleagues ask questions, because I've been working with you on this for a long time, and we've had many conversations together without an audience about all of these things. It's been a real pleasure to see you develop as a scholar on this topic. You were in J201 with me your first year at U of O, then you were in J314 with me toward the end of your media studies career, so I've kind of seen you work through these ideas from the very beginning. I'm an academic proponent of Dick Hebdige. I really love Dick Hebdige's work, and so to see you apply it in this way is really quite amazing. Now, I will say one thing about this presentation. The first thing you do at Colorado State when you get there for graduate school, which is awesome, is to give this as a guest lecture in whatever class you're TAing for. So that was excellent. Yeah, I think I have a couple of questions that I think I'll just wait on and let them kind of simmer a little bit more, and then I'll just turn it over to my colleagues to take it over.
Bravo! Colorado State.
Yeah.
I'm happy. I hope it goes well there. I'd like to hear maybe towards the end what your ideas and plans are for future work, but that's like future work. Because I have to ask some questions that I probably you're gonna want to kick me out of the room, but because they're very basic and stupid, and they have to do with two things. First of all, let me all back up and say bravo, fantastic. Work and fantastic presentation, which is excellent. I am having a hard time, and I know you're making a very strong case that memes are unique. Internet memes are unique. And I want to say, yeah, of course they are, but then again, I keep thinking, no, can they really? Gosh, and I'm trying to think of some wonderful examples to give you, no, but there's this, and this. And then I go, well, no. Is it only the way that they can be distributed so quickly and anonymously and all that? Or is it only the technology? Because I'm thinking of everything from artists going back as far as we want to go, who produce something and then other artists would respond, and then they respond back. And it was slower, of course. I'm thinking of maybe not the same kind of thing as memes, but symbols. I mean, even the swastika, the peace symbol, and so forth, that were they had some meaning and quite controversial, obviously, and were picked up and used, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I just want to be maybe hear how you would convince someone like me that'll say, yeah, but no, is it really you?
Yeah. So I think definitely the technology itself has increased the rate of that process, like you mentioned. I think that's a big part of why memes have become so unique as a medium, particularly. But I think aside from that, what's also important about them is, like, unlike other forms of media, you can't really distinguish between this was the original version and this was the response to it. There's really no way to say, well, this version is more valid than this other version. One example that might be a good way to think about it is like fan fiction. So you've got the original version that someone creates, and someone, based off of those characters, creates their own version of it in response to it, either as a sequel or as their own version of it. But there's still that distinction of the original owner, creator can say, well, this is my official version of it, and you're more than welcome to create your fan fiction, but that exists somehow separately. But with internet memes, that distinction, it's really hard to draw that line by saying, well, these versions are the official ones. These are the ones that I approve of these ones, and these ones, for some reason, are not the official meaning. And the inability to draw that distinction as clearly, I think, is part of what makes them behave uniquely in that way.
But you've traced it back to its origin.
Sure, but the thing also is, like, that this entire presentation and tracing it back to those history, even though we can identify the original cartoon frame in which this image appears in, the fact remains that for most people, understanding this meme when they see it coming across, on their news feeds or on their Twitter feeds, they are not necessarily aware of that entire history. They're not seeing that entire background as well. They're seeing whatever version of that meme they get themselves, which through the process of the election especially got really redefined from its original cartoon meanings into something new. And even if you are able to then show somebody, well, here's where it actually came from, they're not going to be able to suddenly, section off all these other instances of it that they've seen as well.
I'll keep thinking about it. But I mean, and I'm just still trying to work on that in my head, because sometimes I think there's all kinds of things that are really profound about what's going on in the internet, digital life and all that, but I also kind of think about how there are, what's different and what's similar or another permutation or something. And I'm always doing that, and I get, royally put in my place. Oh, history. I have to deal with history. So yeah, but you're doing a great job of convincing me. But I'll keep thinking about the other big area that I want to ask about that I'm still struggling with. I love Hebdige too, and I had the opportunity to once meet him at a Disney conference, which was really interesting and cool, and I'd love to get him here. We should work on it, get him here to talk, which would be exciting. And all the subcultural stuff he does has been great. I'm confused though, and I think maybe I'm not the only one. I shouldn't be confused because I sit here at a university and I should know the answers to everything, but I don't. And what's going on in the world right now? What is the dominant culture and what is the mainstream culture? And I'm confused also about the subculture. I mean, and his argument is, as you kind of take him on at Bravo, because things do change. And you say that memes can't be. He says the subcultures are eventually commodified by the dominant culture. If the subculture is the white nationalists and all of that, why would the dominant culture want to commodify that? But have I got it all wrong? I'm a little bit confused about these things, and I think that I'm probably not the only one these days.
Yeah, and I think that is a lot of the problem as well, trying to identify, like you said, what actually is the dominant culture, what is the mainstream culture, and where does this group of white nationalists fit in with that. It's difficult to kind of always determine those relationships. And I think one way, and that's a lot of the problems with Hebdige as well, is like he's saying that, oh, there's this clear group and here's this clear subgroup. Right. And what I've found is that, well, those distinctions aren't necessarily as set in stone as he had originally laid out. And the fact that, the small group is able to prevent that larger group from controlling the image itself suggests that relationship might not necessarily be the same as it was written in the first place. To answer your other question about why would the mainstream culture, whatever that is, anyways, want to commodify something being used by this white nationalist group, I think what happened, at least in the case of Pepe the Frog, is by the circumstances themselves, Matt Furie kind of got implicated in this entire process as people were saying, oh, this is a symbol of white nationalism. He created it originally, and so he was, in a sense, trying to defend himself, saying, well, no, like, I'm not a white nationalist. Yeah. I just created this cartoon. I would like to, redefine my image and, have my official meanings come back to it. And so that might have been a lot of what the process that started that, even though, as we found, it didn't necessarily play out as he would have hoped.
Yeah, I think it gets especially complicated these days because I look at, would we say that the dominant culture involves, I don't know, just say a Trump and his supporters?
Yeah.
Or are they, I mean, what's the dominant culture? Maybe other people can explain that to me. shows
high schoolers,
political
college students,
confusion.
young people that like to share their ideas through a picture. Like you stub your toe and so you use the Pepe the Frog thing to like, it's like, oh, it feels good, man, but it's like ironic in that way.
Yeah,
So it's people just joking with each other and sharing those images.
right. No, I understand that, and that's good. Just that argument of Hebdige's and the attempt to take it over and then commodify it. That kind of confuses me. It also confuses me that some of the images sometimes are already commodified.
Mm-hmm.
The image of Homer,
Right.
for instance. So that complicates things too. But I got that. Thanks for that.
I don't want to jump in that.
Yeah, but please, because I'm.
But I think there's something here though to keep thinking about capitalism,
Mhm.
right? Because there's a shifting nature of capitalism, and online technologies and especially social media are completely based now around user-generated content, right? This is also user-generated content, but it's different.
Mhm.
I definitely am not presenting an answer to you to this. I'm just amplifying some of these questions, and I know you have them too. Which is there's something philosophically changing here about the notion of capitalism itself. And so when Hebdige was able to formulate this stuff, those lines were a little brighter, you know, and they're not that they're just different now. I don't want to say they're less bright; they're just different. So just some food for
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'll finish by saying I look forward to your further research and thoughts and so forth as you continue, because just to tie it into capitalism, it has proven to be incredibly flexible in terms of just maintaining itself, and I want hope that maybe it won't continue. Anyway, that final little thought, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Janet's right about history, and this is not a surprise coming from me as a historian. I think that one of the things going forward as you work on your master's thesis and hopefully your PhD, I think that you ought to think more about history and the relationship between print and capitalism in the United States in particular. One of the theorists that you ought to look at is Benedict Anderson, the anthropologist, who writes about the nation as an imagined community, which is made possible by the combination, the timely combination in the modern era of print and capitalism. And I started thinking about this when I was thinking about your opening sort of introduction to this, about, how and when have images played a role in past presidential elections? And I think about the not so coincidental timing of the rise of steam printing in the United States, which coincided with the rise of Jacksonian democracy and presidential campaign slogans and songs and print. And you allude to those as memes, and actually you provide a really interesting, ironic rendition of the Lord's Prayer in your written thesis. I think that there's something there. I think that this might actually be a logical, if not scary, development of what has been American democracy's relationship with print culture. Here we live in an age of digital literacy, not print literacy, but we're still using those technologies, right, to communicate ideologies and to advocate for particular positions. And I'm wondering, if your future work, you don't have to answer this now, but you should remember it, right, when you're thinking about your next work, and how you elaborate on this. What are these connections? And I think this idea of dominant culture and capitalism and print have just really simmering beneath the surface of this great work. And I would,
Can I add a reference to that when you do that? A piece by Elizabeth Eisenstein about the introduction of print is just major and excellent. I'll set the whole thing up. So anyway, just a reference. Sorry.
Yeah, and I was just going to say too, I'm interested in how this larger discussion is a discussion about an anxiety about the net in general, and what effect will the impending beginning of net neutrality have I was just thinking about that today. The first thing I saw on my iPhone was, my stupid Apple News alerts was, date for ending of net neutrality set. And oh gosh, not a good way to start. April 23rd, 2 days after the Queen's birthday. So just thoughts. I also finally want to say, Ben, that I've sat through dozens of these, 17 alone in last spring, and I have never ever wanted to check superior for quality of oral defense. But this is the best oral defense I've seen in an honors college thesis. It was.
Listen, it's not every day I say this, but that was like attending a lecture.
Yeah.
That was not a defense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as a fellow person who takes pride in their visual presentation, that was truly outstanding. So, let me just say a couple things now at the end here. Number one, when you first came to me with this idea, and you expressed some anxiety about like being taken seriously, and you're talking to the right person for that, right?
Yeah.
Like to work professionally as a pornography historian, I daily have to deal with people thinking I'm not doing something serious. And what I want to say today at the end of this journey that you've been on is that I think I told you back then, and I definitely tell all of my graduate students and undergrads this, which is that if you want to be taken seriously, you have to treat your topic seriously. You have to do it very thoroughly, and you have to demonstrate to people that you are taking it seriously. There is no question that you have done that. It immediately was obvious. So well done. You treated it seriously. There's no way anybody could say otherwise. Great job. I do want to focus on something you said at the very end, which was when you said, quote, "It's impossible to ever fully commodify a meme." And I thought it was interesting to use the word fully.
Right.
To fully commodify a meme. Does that mean you're leaving a little door open for some commodification of a meme?
Partially.
Okay.
And I think that's a lot of the reason I wanted to do that is we've seen a lot of instances where, like say a corporation will actually try to use a particular meme for within an advertisement to sell their products, and in that sense, they're able to partially tap into the meme mechanism and use it for their own commercial gain. But what I'm saying is that they're never able to fully control the mechanism itself. They're always kind of at the whims of the internet entirely. So in my actual written defense, I used the example of Shutterstock trying to sell this image, the distracted boyfriend meme. There's even a more recent example in the Super Bowl. The Tide ads, they ran these ads saying that, oh, they've got these really clean shirts, it has to be a Tide ad. And they opened it up with, does that mean that any ad in the Super Bowl is a Tide ad? Which quickly spread into this online meme as well, where people would show like this picture of like there was an image from, say, the Star Wars trailer. It says, look at how clean this Millennium Falcon is. Must be a Tide ad. But of course, that's good ad marketing for Tide in that sense, that anything can be a Tide ad, but they're also running the risk of some maybe not so happy images being used within the same mechanism. So for instance, there was that image of as a Klan rally and said, look at how clean these robes are. Must be a Tide ad.
Yeah.
And because, like we talked about, that inability to distinguish, well, these ones are the official use, these ones aren't, by using this mechanism, Tide kind of ran that risk. Like, well, maybe this will spread this message, but maybe our brand will be on these not so popular ideologies as well. And so that's what I mean when you can't ever fully commodify it. They can kind of tap into that mechanism a little bit, but it's always at the risk that something like this will happen.
Yeah. I also like that phrasing because it also shows that you're still open to thinking about it. That's good. The last thing that I want to say is, of course, now for the rest of your life, people will send you things about Pepe and memes.
Yes.
That's how it works. So just the other day in the New York Times, I'm sure you saw, or February 9th, I believe, they had a whole special story on the mainstreaming of political memes. Did you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so what I want to draw your attention to in this, which you've already read, is just the way that it points out that there are people behind the scenes funding the creation of memes for political ends.
Yep.
And they have specific companies and references to people and dollar amounts that are doing this. Now, I think that is really interesting for the questions that have already come up about capitalism and history and also manipulation, because those are all things that Hebdige was interested in too. So you can just take this right with you back to Colorado, okay, and just keep going. All right. So I think, should we step outside?
Do we have time for the
Oh yeah. Does anybody else want to
Briefly.
ask any questions or comment?
I got one for you,
That's
right? I was interested to say you brought up art because I think his ideas about like authors are interesting. Like your quote from Death of the Author. So my question would be like, what responsibility does an author have of a meme have to protecting their art, especially if like they're from that dominant group? Like, do they have a responsibility to prevent subcultures from repurposing it? Is it even possible to prevent people from like repurposing your art? Like, could Furie have done anything to prevent Pepe from being turned into this hate speech?
You know, I thought about that a lot. Is what could he have done to stop this from happening? And I think where he could have made a different decision was early on when it was first spreading online, and he decided, I'm not going to be involved in this whatsoever. That was the point where he really lost control completely. If he had early on said, okay, you know, I want to try to be involved with how it's spreading online, I want to weigh in a little bit more on how it's being used, he may have had more of a stake later on. But the fact that he early on said, you know, whatever happens on the internet happens on the internet, he kind of just left that open there. Although at the same time, if he had tried to control the image more at that point, it may have not reached meme status or spread as widely as it had, and we would be having, you know, an entirely different conversation now. So I think as the creator of one of these images, you kind of have to assess whether or not, you know, you want this to reach widespread popularity and how much you're going to try to maintain control of it as long as you can. The fact being, though, that once something is on the internet and spreading in those online communities, there's always the chance that, you know, it's going to be memeified and take off in its own direction. And so as an author, you might have, you know, limited ability to stop that from happening, maybe only delay it somewhat. So as far as, you know, actual responsibility goes, I think you can try to limit it best you can, but if you can stop anyone on the internet from doing what they want with your content, then, you know, you've solved a lot of the problems of the internet right there. So,
You know, I'm just going to add something to that really quick. One of the things that you'll quickly learn about in graduate school is the spin-off research, right? If you need to have a conference paper or something, you could take your main research and spin it off. And I think this question makes me think about a possible spin-off for you, which is Bill Waterston. I think that's his name, the Calvin and Hobbes creator, who there were many, to go back to your point, there were many memes of Calvin like pissing on the Ford logo, made into stickers, right?
Yeah.
And I think he always just ignored those things, I think. But that could be a spin-off conference paper or something for you, like comparing Furie and Waterston, and also the development kind of like me, like I don't know, or something. But your question maybe.
absolutely.
Other comments?
Someone else?
Okay. Should we just take a minute? Sure. All right.
Don't go away.
We're just gonna leave now
Wait,
and never come back. So.
We never saw them again.
Wish.
Good job.
Thank you all so much for coming. It means a lot to me.